On January 15th, 2025, the United States Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case called Free Speech Coalition, or FSC, versus Paxton. This case will determine the fate of 19 state laws protecting children from access to online pornography through mandatory age verification requirements. Most children are first exposed to pornography when they are somewhere between 7 and 13 years old, and by the time they are 18, most of them have seen it. This case is historic, but for far more than just this reason. Pornography is the marketing arm of the sexual revolution. It has been since that revolution got going in the 1960s. Now, the Supreme Court could rule in June that states have the right and duty to protect children from the harms of pornography. Such a ruling would unseat the ethics of the sexual revolution from its place in the minds of most people as the primary lens through which they think about and engage in physical intimacy. In this series, we will explore the broken promises and heartbreaking results of the sexual revolution, primarily through the internet, and thereby gain a better understanding of just how much is at stake in this historic case. I'm Joseph Kohm, the Policy Director at Family Policy Alliance, and you're listening to a podcast from Family Policy Alliance Foundation. In this episode, we're going to be dealing with the intersection of pornography and pediatric sexual assault. And I'm so honored to be joined by a great guest and a valued colleague. Her name is Heidi Olson. Heidi is a registered nurse. She's also the founder and president of Paradigm Shift Training and Consulting, which equips healthcare workers with skills-based training to be able to identify human trafficking and exploitation. We're so honored to have her join us. I've had the privilege of testifying alongside Heidi, and she is one of the most important and powerful voices in our movement to protect children and the population from pornography. So Heidi, welcome on to this episode of this project. It's so great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
No, we're the ones honored to have you. So why don't you start just to warm our audience up by telling them a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this field of pediatric care, and maybe just a little about why you started speaking out on this particular connection between pornography and pediatric assault.
Absolutely. So I am a nurse, first and foremost. I've been a nurse for about 15 years. And I've always worked with kids my entire nursing career. I love kids. I think they're fantastic. They're so resilient, and it's fun getting to interact with them. So I've done lots of different types of pediatric nursing, but about 10 years ago, I ended up becoming a sexual assault nurse examiner. And I think for a lot of people, they're like, I've never even heard of that. I didn't know that was a kind of nursing. I didn't either when I was in nursing school. But essentially, we are a very unique type of nursing where we are trained specifically to care for victims of sexual assault. So I did my training to do that specifically with kids who had been sexually assaulted. And while it's, obviously a really heavy and can be a really sad job, it's also an incredibly rewarding job. And so I just absolutely loved it and started doing that full time. What I realized, so if you had asked 22-year-old Heidi graduating from nursing school, hey, someday you are going to go talk about pornography to lots of different groups, I would have been like, no way, not doing that job. Don't want to do it. That sounds awful. But my tune has completely changed because as I became a forensic nurse, I was starting to see trends that nobody was talking about. I did not receive any training on how pornography influences sexual violence. I didn't receive any training on how social media or pornography are affecting kids. I received zero training on child-on-child sexual assault. And yet I was seeing these trends all the time as a brand new forensic nurse. So in about 2015, I started to dig into data at our hospital and really start to connect the dots to say we're seeing an alarming amount of kids who are sexually assaulting other kids, and no one's talking about it. And what are we doing about this as a society? And what I wanted to know is this just, so I'm based in Kansas City. I wanted to know, is this a Kansas City specific thing? Is this a US specific thing? Is this a global thing? And as I have done research and talked to experts and explored this issue over the last 10 years, we're seeing this trend being echoed all across the world, that so many kids are sexually assaulting other kids because they're imitating what they're seeing in pornography. And it's, I think, the best kept secret. No one's talking about it. And yet it's this massive issue causing so much trauma with kids today.
Yeah, brilliantly said, Heidi. It's your ambition and empathy that drove you to step into this. That is why your voice is so powerful, because you're brilliant at what you do, but you clearly feel deeply for what's going on, and you see this vacuum of people not speaking out about this issue. And that's the point of this project: is to raise awareness amongst our supporters and those who care about this country and what's happening at the Supreme Court, of just how much is at stake in this case. It's dramatic. So clearly, Heidi, you believe that exposure to pornography is a risk factor for pediatric sexual assault. A risk factor just means that someone is more likely to engage in a particular behavior if they've done this other thing first. So, what I'm asking you, Heidi, I think we already know the answer is exposure to pornography in children a risk factor for them to go on and commit a pediatric sex crime? But if so, how serious of a risk factor is it? Like, how central is it in the causation formula, I guess, for these terrible crimes?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. Especially early exposure to pornography, so a child being exposed at a young age, there's a higher likelihood that they are then going to behave in inappropriate and harmful ways sexually, because they're watching this really violent, degrading, dehumanizing content over and over and over. They're going to think, this is how I have sex, this is how I interact sexually, or I want to try out the things I'm watching. And so it's resulting in a lot of sexual violence and harm. I've seen really young kids who have sexually assaulted other kids, probably not even fully understanding what's going on. And I've seen teenagers assault other teenagers in the most horrifically brutal fashion. And pornography is always a piece of the pie. And so, kind of in terms of saying, what percentage does pornography use influence sexual violence? It's hard to put a number on it, but here's kind of what I can give you. We have research that absolutely backs this up, saying kids who are exposed to pornography are more likely to go on to sexually assault. Kids who are exposed to pornography are more likely to be sexually assaulted. So there's multiple risk factors that are going on here. Kids who are exposed to pornography are more likely to be depressed, to have anxiety, to have disturbed relationships with their families, with their peers. So there's so many mental health and even physical health implications and societal implications that we don't talk about. When we look at data from our hospital, but this data is being echoed around the world as well, anywhere from a third to half of the perpetrators, so we're keeping track of perpetrators' ages, are kids under the age of 18, with the biggest age range being 11 to 15-year-old males. And we know pornography is almost always a factor in that. So there's other risk factors for sure, like, maybe having attachment pain or trauma in a child's life, not having coping mechanisms, experiencing physical abuse or neglect. Sometimes sexual trauma will, not always, will be a risk factor as well, but pornography is always in that mix. I talked to a therapist who works with kids who have sexually assaulted other kids, and he said, yeah, pornography, it's just determining, it's always a piece of the pie, just how big of a piece of the pie was the pornography influence. And so I've heard this echoed over and over and over with first responders, kids who are sexually assaulting other kids. There's some element of pornography influencing that.
I want to pause for a moment here, Heidi, to affirm our audience and what they're feeling after hearing you describe all of that so well. If you are shocked and appalled by this, you are right to feel that way. The pornography and the overall sex industry thrives on lack of awareness. I think most people, especially these kids, take pornography use or consumption very lightly. Like, oh, it's no big deal. It's not even cheating on your significant other. And what you've just said, Heidi, shows just how unfathomably untrue that is. And if our audience is shocked, I want you to be affirmed in your feelings and know that you should be. This is the point, and this is what we tolerate by allowing pornography such easy access and influence over our children. So, Heidi, you talked about some of the things depicted in pornography and how children are imitating that. And we know because kids are mostly exposed to this before their parents get the chance to exercise their parental right of talking to their kids about sex before anyone or anything else. What is it that porn is normalizing to children or to people generally that the average person who takes it lightly might not be aware of. Obviously, there's some violence involved, and you and I have talked about that and advocated about it elsewhere. But are there other aspects of pornography that and sexual intimacy that pornography itself is normalizing to these kids and thereby encouraging them in this direction?
Yeah, there are so many facets. And I want to validate what you're saying. If you are feeling, anyone listening, overwhelmed, triggered, freaked out, that is not my intent. So please listen to this with care. If you need to take a break, please do. And what I'm about to say is going to be even more difficult to listen to. But I think it's important to think about, if you're a parent, if you're a professional, think about how you learned about sex. So I have a friend, and she said, when I was in middle school, I heard kids at school talking about a blowjob, and I didn't know what that was. I knew it was like, something that was kind of a secret, but I asked my mom. I get in the car after school, and I'm like, "Hey mom, what's a blowjob?" And she's like, I could see my mom's hands on the steering wheel, like, just like, and she's like, "I don't know. I've never heard that term before." Her curiosity about a blowjob did not go away, right? Her mom could have handled that in a way to say, "Hey, here's what it means. What other questions do you have? Let's talk about sexual boundaries." Because her mom just shut it down and felt freaked out by that, she went and asked friends who told her all this inaccurate, really like degrading information. So the ante has been upped by 1,000 with the internet when we have kids that are like, I'm curious about, I want to see a naked body. I've heard this term at school, whatever it may be. When they type, say boobs into their Google browser, a 7, 8-year-old probably doesn't think that they're going to see what they end up seeing. And what they end up seeing within 2 clicks of being online is extremely violent content. So a mainstream porn scene today, what kids are watching and what's teaching them about how to quote unquote have sex is, it's very selfish, right? So there is no concept of intimacy within pornography. It's consumptive. It's all about, I want this thing and I'm taking it from you. It's not about mutuality. It's not about respect. It's not about attuning to another person. So looking at another person, right, and saying, "Oh, is this something you want to be doing? You look uncomfortable." It's about take, take, take. I don't care if you're saying no. I don't care if you're crying. I don't care or if the mascara is going down your face. I will continue to penetrate and harm you because this is what I want. So lots of scenes like that, like very violent anal penetration, gagging. So again, penis in the throat, gagging a female, she may be crying, and the person, the male in these scenes, they're not stopping, right? There's no attunement of, you're not enjoying this. It's, this is what I want to do. Ejaculation on the face is a huge theme. Strangulation is massively huge in pornography right now. I cannot tell you the amount of teenagers I've taken care of that have been strangled by another teenager because they're reenacting what they're seeing in pornography. Strangulation can cause brain damage very easily. It can be lethal, and kids have no idea. It's, I'm just reenacting what I'm seeing, and this is quote unquote sexy, so I'm going to do it to you, and I could kill you not knowing that. Multiple men penetrating one woman. So lots of kind of like gangbang theme type of pornography that kids are seeing. What I'm seeing trend wise is a lot of kids who, because they're so desensitized to seeing naked bodies all the time, they are filming each other. So during an assault, during a sexual encounter, and then just sharing it with everyone at school. So there's just these multiple layers of exploitation that are going on with kids, with porn being such an influence in all of this. So we see lots of assaults that are mirroring what I just described. A lot of violence, strangling, ejaculation on the face, filming it, distributing it, with very much, you can see porn kind of driving what's behind it.
It's so astonishing and so awful, Heidi. And I'm just thankful to you for your courage to describe it to all of us, because everyone, I think most of our supporters who just heard you describe that will fortunately be lucky enough to know that that's not what actual sex is. And I'm so glad you gave the example of a parent being forced to confront this, because Family Policy Alliance's approach, our original approach to this issue, was that we believe parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children, and that includes talking to them about sex. But if parents get rightfully shocked about this and their children have uninhibited access to pornography, this is what they're experiencing and this is what they think sex is. And clearly, this has horrific results that you've seen firsthand in so many different victims. And there are many, many implications to everything you just described, and we're exploring that in this series of podcasts leading up to this case. So, what I want to ask you about next is you've talked about, all the content that's being normalized, and frankly, is telling lies to kids about what real sex in a healthy relationship and marriage is. You've talked about how widespread this is, how you see it in so many of your victims. So I just wanted to ask if you could share with us, because I know you've examined so many victims about this. Are there any of their stories that you're able to share with us briefly to kind of illustrate this point, to bring this home in a really individually empathetic sense for our audience?
Yes, absolutely. There's more stories than we have time to share, hundreds and hundreds of stories. And there's so much trauma behind every single one of those stories for everyone, the victim, the family. I would say even for the perpetrators who have been exposed to this material and just have had no intervention. And so I think it's multifaceted, just ripple effect trauma happening from early exposure to pornography. So a couple of stories that come to mind, as I talk to different groups about this or testify, what I want to show is there's a causational relationship. So when you go through all of the research, and there's tons of research showing this relationship, it's always like, okay, well, there's a correlation, but do we really know? So I will say anecdotally, yes, we really know that kids viewing pornography, they end up acting it out. Maybe not every single kid, right? But kids who are acting out with harmful sexual behaviors, there's a connection to pornography. So a couple of examples. We took care of a 13-year-old female, and her disclosure to us was, my 16-year-old brother was looking at pornography in his room. He came into my bedroom and said, I was looking at porn and I can't stop thinking about it, and then proceeded to rape her. So you can see that here I'm fantasizing about this. I can't stop thinking about it. I would guess there's likely some kind of addiction to it at this point. So now I have to escalate my behaviors. I don't care that this is my sister. I don't care if it hurts her. Again, that consumptive, I'm going to do what I want in this moment. Another story, this story never ceases to it was so hard for me to wrap my brain around it. And the only thing that I could think of was pornography is influencing this. So we took care of a 14-year-old female a couple of years ago. And she was hanging out at a park with a bunch of friends after school. So a bunch of high schoolers sitting, on these benches together, hanging out, talking. She walks into a public bathroom. 3 14-year-old boys from school follow her in there, and they gang rape her in the bathroom. They walk out of the bathroom. Of course, no one checks on her. There's, again, no attunement. So she realizes, like, I have to walk out of the bathroom at some point. So she, gets up her courage, walks out. All of her classmates are still there. They all know what happened, right? They could all hear what was going on in the bathroom, and these boys are talking about it. As she walks out of the bathroom, her classmates started cheering, like applauding, like, congratulations, this happened to you. And my mind was blown as, I'm reading through this disclosure, because I'm like, no one asked her if she was okay. No one called the police. No one told their parents. The way she ended up in our hospital is because she disclosed to her mom, and her mom brought her in. And I think for me, I'm like, pornography is the only way I can explain this behavior, this completely callous behavior where kids are watching things like gangbang. And so when this girl is raped by multiple boys, the lines between fantasy, I'm watching this all the time, and reality have been completely blurred. So now we don't realize that this is actually traumatic. It's harming our classmate. It's like, well, we watch this all the time, so like, no big deal. It's a badge of honor that you were gang raped. We're all going to cheer for you because it's what we see in porn all the time. And I think the implications of that are so scary when kids are not understanding what healthy sexual boundaries are. And in fact, they're equating sexual violence with kind of what you should be doing. I think the ramifications of what we're going to see from all of this in the years to come is really scary.
Yeah, it's terrifying, Heidi. It's so sad too, because if you've ever been in a committed relationship where you know what real sexual intimacy is supposed to be, the way we at FPA believe God designed it to be, it's supposed to be nurturing and healing and bringing
Yeah.
you together with your partner. And it's just so sad to think of so many of our young people growing up with the complete inverse distortion of that, and it's why we're so motivated on this issue, and I know you are too. So, speaking of that kind of motivation and action that we've taken, I want to champion Heidi here for a moment, because she and I had the honor of testifying together before one of the California state assemblies committees when they were hearing a bill like this one in question that the Supreme Court will consider in January. And Heidi, I think we only had 2 or 3 minutes each in our
Yeah.
testimony, and to just brag on Heidi for how brilliant of a communicator she is. She was able to fit pretty much all of this into 2 to 3 minutes, and you could watch the minds of the committee shifting as we did this. They ended up voting unanimously on the bill, so that was a congratulations to her efforts and those of our Family Policy Council there in California, California Family Council. So you and I, you did that. We've argued before this case or this law in the California State House and in others. I want to ask you, Heidi, what was it like to you to bring this kind of information to a legislative committee that had clearly never heard of it before? Like most of you in the audience, if you're hearing this for the first time, it's okay. That's normal. Most people haven't, but especially these legislators had not. So, so Heidi, what was that like for you to have to be the carrier of the herald of this awful news to these folks that have been elected to serve their constituents?
Yeah, and that's such a cool opportunity. It always is an honor to be invited into something like that. So, I think it felt like an honor. It's like no matter how they vote, it's honest to speak the truth about what's going on. But I think their reaction is really normal. So I've testified in multiple states, multiple settings, and which has been such an incredible opportunity. But I wouldn't say there's ever an audience that I've talked to about this where they're like, oh yeah, we already knew that. It's always like a deer in the headlights, like, oh no, please tell the nurse to stop talking. Like, we can't take anymore. And I get it because it is heavy and it's traumatic, but I think at the same time it is so alarming to me that there aren't more alarm bells going off, right? Where are the other first responders that are seeing these trends? Like, why are we not shouting this from the rooftops? To me, that feels really concerning. Just to add on to that, I taught a multidisciplinary team a couple of months ago. So these were sex crime detectives, physicians, nurses, social workers, child protective services, forensic interviewers. I mean, anyone who would encounter a child who's experienced sexual violence. And I'm talking about this trend, of kids being exposed to pornography and acting out what they're seeing. And everyone there was like, we've never thought about this before. So we think about the people who are investigating sex crimes against children are making zero connection to the pornography link. I mean, so it's not surprising that our legislators don't know it. It's not surprising that our judges are not considering it, that our other professionals are not. And I think to me, that just feels really scary that hardly anyone's connecting the dots when this is such a huge issue.
Indeed, it's a public health crisis, and if we've elected our leaders to do anything, it's to do things to help protect us from this, especially our kids, some of the most vulnerable people among us. So I completely agree, Heidi. And like I said earlier in this episode, this industry thrives on lack of awareness. It thrives on us knowing about this. So the more we speak the truth about it, the more it brings into the light what's done in the darkness and exposes it. And I think certainly all our supporters have helped get us to this point where the Supreme Court has to seriously consider all these things. You've written an excellent amicus brief, a friend of the court brief for this case, where you bring this to their light. And I hope and pray that they reference it. I've been at the court recently, and I know that they are reading these briefs and it is influencing them. So I pray to God more than any other brief that yours gets in front of them, Heidi. So I only have a couple more questions for you before we close out this episode. So speaking of the court, I want to ask you, because you have to handle this fallout and bear the weight of this so often. If the court rules what we believe to be the constitutional and correct way to allow these 19 state laws protecting children from pornography to continue to be in place and enable more states to pass them, how do you think that would positively boost our fight against pediatric sex crimes and the influence of the sex industry overall?
Yeah, I am hoping and praying, they rule the correct way also. Because what I really see being a positive effect to these age verification laws is it's protecting kids from accidental exposure.
Hmm.
So if you look at research, about 80% of kids are accidentally exposed to pornography the first time they see it. And I often ask audiences when I'm presenting to them, do you think that's on purpose? Like, do you think the porn industry is purposefully, creating pornography or pop-ups or YouTube videos or whatever where kids are accidentally seeing it? Yes, of course they are. We know the younger a kid's exposed to pornography, the more likely they will go on to be a lifelong user. So if your bottom line is I want to make money off of this, you better believe I'm going to expose kids as young as I can so they be addicted throughout their lifetime, which is sick and evil and feels very predatory. And so I believe there's design behind those 80% of kids who are unintentionally being exposed. And that's traumatic for them when they're seeing this content and they don't know what to do with it. And I have a lot of empathy for those kids. My heart is not, oh, these are bad kids and I think they need to be punished and XYZ. It's, I am so sorry. We as adults have not protected you from this content in a better way. So I think these laws are a really good first layer. Is it perfect? No. Are there kids that are going to be able to get around this? Yes. Right. And I think that's the argument a lot of people make is like, well, it's not perfect. Kids are going to use, VPNs and all these other things. It's like, okay, but for the 4, 5, 6-year-old that, maybe is accidentally going to see something right now where there is no age verification law, that matters. And so I think that I'm hoping and praying, right, if these age verification laws are able to stay in place, that it's going to result in less child-on-child sexual assault, less addiction throughout someone's lifetime, less trauma, healthier sexual relationships. So I think there's a lot of good that could come out of this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Heidi. I think this is so critical to preventing the kind of actual evil that you have described to us in this episode. And that's why we're just praying for the court. I invite our audience, please join us to pray for the justices, to pray for the team of Attorney General Paxton in Texas who will be arguing this case. We really believe this would reduce a lot of what Heidi has described. And I'm glad you brought that argument too, Heidi, about how people have told us pretty much every state we've argued in, oh, kids will be able to get around this. Well, some kids, a select few kids, can get around things like age requirements to purchase alcohol. That doesn't mean we let all kids suddenly purchase it themselves. We're catching the vast majority of kids in that net. And this would work even more effectively than that. There'd be people that slip through the cracks, but we'd be protecting the vast majority. And that's really, really worth it, we think. So, Heidi, my last substantive question for you is this. If you were to issue our audience with a brief challenge for how they could make a difference in this area, what would it be?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two main things. And one is just raising awareness. So just like we were talking about, I think the massive lack of awareness is harming kids because we're not having conversations we need to be having. I often challenge people that I'm presenting to of ask your kids, have they seen pornography? What are they seeing at school? What are kids talking about? Because I guarantee there's way more going on than parents are aware of, especially if they have access to devices. I've done this in multiple states, multiple countries at this point, and every time I have participants come back and they're like, yeah, I didn't know my kids were looking at pornography. I had a nurse who said, I asked my 14-year-old daughter, and what she said was like, oh, do you mean like Pornhub porn or like kids sending each other nudes? Because both of those things are happening at school, right? So the reality is this is affecting kids from all backgrounds, all socioeconomic statuses. I mean, even if you feel like you have all these parameters in place, it's still possible kids are talking about and exposing them to pornography or to sexual content. So, and I'd say beyond just the visual thing, what I keep hearing from females is there's a lot of exposure happening through books, like erotic fantasy kind of novels that young girls are really getting addicted to pornography. That's the gateway. So I think there's multiple facets. So be aware, have conversations. But I think my last call sort of to action in all of this, and I know this is a hard one and this is a controversial one and it should not be, but I think for a lot of adults, there is a lack of inaction because they are participating in this. And so when we have adults who are frequently looking at pornography, who are addicted to pornography, who are lying to, their families, their significant others, whatever about this, it's really hard to enter into your child's life and say, hey, this is harmful behavior because I'm actually participating in it over here. And we know that. I mean, if you look at research and the rates of just adults in general who are viewing pornography, it's off the charts, and that's in church and outside of church, right? So I think I understand the dopamine hit that happens with pornography. I understand it's highly addicting. So again, this is not a shame talk, but it is you have to address what's going on in your own life if you also don't want your child to be exposed and harmed to this. And I think that's where I get a lot of rationalization from people too, of like, well, I look at porn and I've never sexually assaulted someone. Okay, doesn't mean it's healthy behavior, and it doesn't mean it's a healthy behavior for your child. So I think that would just be my call to action is, yeah, it harms kids, it harms adults too.
Yeah, that's so well said. I think anyone who follows FPA knows how important the issue of addiction is to us, and particularly to our CEO, Craig DeRoche, because of his own incredible, dramatic recovery story where God just rescued him from addiction. And the first thing he would say would be that God didn't do that just for him. God blesses us to be a blessing. So, because you're right about that, Heidi, God wants to see adults set free from addiction so that they can bless children by protecting them too. So that is so in line with us and our mission and vision at FPA. And I'm so thankful for your courage in saying it. I'll just add to you other things folks can do is that those 19 state laws that were passed, and most of them were passed through the action of one of our state family policy councils, like California Family Council or the Virginia Family Foundation. If you are not connected with and involved with your local state FPC, we have them in over 40 states. You can find them all at familypolicyalliance.com/allies. We will link to that in the episode notes, show notes of this episode. But connect with them. They're half the reason this gets done. At least they are the ones that bring in people like Heidi or me to testify on this on these bills. And I would just encourage folks if you care about this issue, you want to push back, you want to help restore sexual ethics in America, your local state FBC is the first place you should go. So Heidi, you've been such a wonderful guest. You're such an you're someone we're so honored to be allied with. So I want to give you a chance to tell our audience where can they follow you and your work, and how can they support you?
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And thank you for the work that you all are doing. It's so important. I do not have a strong social media presence because I kind of hate social media, but I am on LinkedIn under Heidi Olson. Feel free to follow me, connect with me. I am so passionate about this topic. So if I can help in any way, shape, or form, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And then I also have a website. It's Paradigm Shift TC, as in training and consulting. You can go to paradigmshifttc.com. You can schedule an appointment with me if you want to chat or if you have more questions or just want to see more resources that I have. So thanks so much for letting me be here and giving me a platform to talk about this.
And Heidi, because you're such a humble person, I'll just also encourage our audience if you like hearing from Heidi, she's a great YouTube search. If you search her name, there's some great produced videos of her talking even more in depth on these subjects than we had time for today. So Heidi, thank you so very much for your time, for your expertise, and just for your strength and bearing the weight of all that you do to help these kids that are victims here and to help other kids get set free from the influence of pornography. So we're so grateful to you for that. And to our audience, I just want to thank you for your time and for your support. As I said earlier, your support is what enables or has enabled us to put the Supreme Court in this position to where they have to rule on these laws and address their historic jurisprudence on pornography. So we're so grateful to you for your support and for your attention. And we just want to say we'll be back soon with more episodes in this limited series we're doing on Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. Thank you. Have a blessed day, and we'll see you soon.